Hello and welcome to our webinar today. We're excited about this topic, the science of feedback. This is always a popular topic. People love, people love to hate. But there's so much research here that Zenger Folkman has done on feedback. Today's webinar is going to be led by our resident expert, Jack Zenger. He's a best-selling author, a highly respected and sought-after speaker, consultant, executive coach. We're glad to have him. And joining Jack on the webinar is renowned psychometrician, Dr. Joseph Folkman. Joe is a best-selling author and speaker, but he's also the co-founder of Zenger Folkman. If you're ever wondered who creates all of these fascinating graphs that we constantly share, Joe's your guy. We also have Maria monitoring the chat today. She's one of our brilliant senior client executives. So she's going to do her best to answer your questions on feedback. And if we don't get those questions answered today, we'll be sure to get your information and get back to you soon. Now, a little bit about Zenger Folkman before we get into everything. I want to tell those who are new here about Zenger Folkman. We're pioneers in leadership development. Jack Zenger and Joe Folkman bring decades of experience to the table, but what truly sets us apart in this crowded field is our laser focus on leadership development and coaching. We're not just another consulting firm, we're research obsessed. And that's why you'll find our work in Forbes and Harvard Business Review and other leading publications on a weekly basis. So here's what makes us different. We're all about strengths. You know, we've been in this industry long enough to know what doesn't work because we've tried it all and we've measured the performance. But the data kept showing us something fascinating. When leaders focus on their strengths instead of fixating on their weaknesses, something remarkable really happens. Suddenly, development isn't scary or this unpleasant chore anymore. Leaders we found become energized and passionate, and their growth is incredible. So here is what we're going to cover today on the webinar and why you should stay to the end. I always like to know what I'm going to get into. So we're going to begin by sharing our research on feedback, talk a little bit about how creating a culture of asking in your organization is so helpful, and finding the balance in the feedback that we get. And that's where that feedback preferences assessment is really going to come in handy. So if you haven't had a chance to take it, I encourage you to hurry and do so. You can see it in the chat over there, because we're going to be talking about those results in this webinar. So after all of that, we're going to share some next steps for how you can connect with us and what you can do to further along your teams and yourself on your feedback journey. So now I'm going to turn the time over to Jack and Joe.
All right. Thank you very much, Marie. Appreciate that introduction to a very interesting and we think very important topic. A quotation from a professor at the University of Sheffield said the following. You can see it on the screen. He says, thanks to feedback, we can become more than simple programs with simple reflexes and develop more complex responses to the environment. Feedback allows animals like us to follow a purpose. We think that really captures the powerful message behind this topic of feedback. Now, we want to talk about a little test that was done some time ago, an experiment at the New York University on this subject of feedback. And the brief description of it goes like this. They enlisted some 62 participants to engage in a kind of a mock negotiation process. It had to do with the sale of a chemical production plant. And they gave them some facts and figures, and they were asked to negotiate the sale of this plant with someone that was kind of their adversary in this negotiation process. They were attached to heart monitors during this negotiation process. And at the end of the negotiation period, the participants were then asked to give feedback to their negotiation partner, adversary, regarding their behavior. Some were asked to give that feedback kind of gratuitously, spontaneously. Others in the experiment were asked to, the recipient was asked to kind of ask his partner for feedback. And he was the one, or she was the one, who enlisted that feedback coming to them. So that was the experiment. What we found was a really interesting thing. The experiment revealed that there was a lot of anxiety during this feedback process. And so we've got a question that we would like to have you kind of think about. What was the stress level for the participants in the feedback portion of this exercise? Was there the greatest stress felt by the recipients of the feedback? Or was the greatest stress felt by the giver of the feedback? Or was it kind of equal for both of them? Did they feel equally stressed based on the results of their heart monitors in this feedback process? So we ask you, if you would, to just jump in, weigh in your opinion on which of those three is the correct statement. So let's see here. What's gonna happen? All right, we can show that on the screen, maybe. All right. Interesting. The greatest stress was not felt by the feedback, by the receiver. It was the giver, and almost an equal number of you, 42%, 43%, kind of said equal amount felt by each. Well, the correct answer is, based on their research, was that the amount of stress felt by the giver and the receiver was virtually equal. We think that's a really important insight about this topic of feedback. And that is, we normally kind of focus on the receiver and his or her reactions or response to it. But what we have learned here from this kind of piece of research is that the givers of feedback are also under stress. And we think that's an important backdrop for what we're going to say today about this, broader topic of feedback. Now, what might be the perceptions that others would have regarding a person who asks for feedback? One perception could be that this person's kind of insecure. They're wanting to kind of, have reassurance. Another perception is that they are only seeking for compliments. They want praise. They're fishing for compliments. A third response is, gosh, these people are really confident and they have a desire to improve. And the reason why they're asking for my feedback is that they really want to learn what I can do better. So it's obvious that there can be very different perceptions of others who would be courageous enough to ask for feedback. We would maybe have you think about it, in a new way. So as the next slide kind of points out, we think that people, we've known from our research that people are perceived as being more effective when they ask for feedback. So Joe, why don't you explain this graph?
So this is a little study here, Jack, only 128,000 people. So what we're looking at here is 360 feedback. And we ask the specific question about a person's rating from others. On average, people were rated by about 13 other respondents, okay, like manager, peer, direct report, and others. They were rated on their effectiveness at asking for feedback. And so on the horizontal scale here, you see the people that were the worst, first to the 9th percentile. They were the worst at asking. And then you have the best at asking. And then the bars represent overall leadership effectiveness. Simply stated here, people who were terrible at asking for feedback, their overall effectiveness rating was at the 15th percentile. That's not good. That's a fail. And people that ask for feedback that were very effective were at the 87th percentile. It appears that this behavior, asking for feedback, is strongly correlated with the, your overall ratings of effectiveness on the 360 feedback. Now, here's the graph that shows asking for feedback, the same question by age groups. And what you notice here is that younger leaders, 25 to 35, they're at the 52nd percentile, but older leaders, 61 years or older, we don't think that's old, do we, Jack?
No, they're still pretty youthful.
Jack and I might be a little bit older than that, but they're at the 43rd percentile. So you see this tendency that as people age, their willingness or desire to ask for feedback goes down. Now, let me show you kind of another graph. And what we've done on this graph is we've eliminated those who are best at asking, in the top quartile at asking. And so if you look at the effect of those who are below the top quartile on asking, and sort of says, say what happens to their leadership effectiveness over time? Nothing happens. It just maintains the below average rate. But if you look at those who ask for feedback, what you see is a steady increase as people age, which is interesting. If you want to age and become more effective, it appears the key to that is to continually ask for feedback. This is a wonderful habit to develop, and we think it is crucial and very important for leaders to do and individual contributors to do. When you think about why you should ask for feedback, number one is people that ask for feedback receive some good suggestions of how they can improve. And asking for feedback sends an interesting signal to others that they value their opinion. When I ask you for feedback, you go, well, okay, you must care. Asking for feedback makes others look more confident. It makes you look more confident. And that's really counterintuitive, because a lot of people think that asking for feedback makes you look like you don't know what you're doing or something like that. But because it is kind of rare, people that ask for feedback actually are perceived as more confident, not less confident. And the best thing about asking for feedback is you discover your blind spots, which are kind of hard to notice if you don't see them, because most people are built wrong. They're looking at you, not themselves. So why ask for feedback? People that ask for feedback are more likely to accept the feedback. The process of asking opens you up to hear the response, because you've set the stage. You're not surprised by it. And so that process of asking really is helpful. Asking for feedback changes the emotions of the interaction. And it changes your emotions because you ask. It changes others' emotions. They want to be generous in giving. And what happens if an organization culture was created where everyone was encouraged to ask for feedback? Right now in organizations, most people believe that it's the job of their manager to give feedback, and it's their job to sit back and receive it. So they wait to hear it, and they don't ask for it. And we think if you could change that situation, Jack, it would really affect the effectiveness of an organization.
Yeah, so if it's not clear, we are strong advocates of creating a culture in an organization where people are asking for feedback rather than sitting back and waiting for it to come. And so we'd like to just share with you a few of our observations about how that can happen more effectively. we do believe that if the senior leaders of the organization are examples or models of asking for behavior, that practice will then permeate the entire organization, and it'll become the thing to do. Now, we have 5 suggestions about this whole process of how you go about creating this asking culture. The first one is that you ask several people. Don't make this something you just do with one person. You've all been to a fun house where they have these interesting mirrors that kind of are, make you look very distorted because that mirror just is not an accurate mirror. What you want to do is to avoid that. You don't want to look in a mirror that's not accurate. And the way you avoid that problem is that you look in several mirrors. And so if you ask several people for their ideas, we think that's a way of making sure you get accurate feedback. Secondly, we're advising people to kind of ask for specifics. When you ask a broad general question, you tend to get broad and general answers that aren't always that helpful. So seeking specificity really does help to build this culture of asking for feedback in a constructive way. I had the experience of having a colleague call me after a presentation that he had made. And he called and said, that presentation I gave, I'm going to give it again. I'd like you to tell me one thing that I can do to make that a better presentation next time. Now, I was really struck by that question and that approach. It made it easy for me to kind of respond because I had remembered his talk. I'd remembered something I thought could have been changed. And it was very comfortable for me to kind of pass on one suggestion. And so by asking for one thing, it makes the whole process less kind of scary and formidable. And it also signals your intent that you want to change. The fourth suggestion we would give to you would be ask frequently. Good habits form and they endure through repetition. And so just the practice of on a daily basis, asking someone for their view, their idea is a good way of creating this asking culture. And the final thing that I would suggest to you is that the word feedback has some very emotional baggage wrapped around it. And maybe just avoiding that word altogether is worth considering. So if you ask someone for their ideas, their suggestions, a piece of advice, it kind of does away with that emotionally laden term feedback. So again, those are 5 specific suggestions about how you can go about in your organization and with your network of colleagues, creating this asking for feedback culture. So let me just ask you to reflect for a moment. What if the most senior person in your firm came to you one day and said, what one thing could I do to be a more effective leader? How would that alter your perception of her or him? What you've heard Joe's research convey is that while some people think that would cause you to view them less favorably, the reality is it causes you to be perceived much more favorably. People see that you are confident. People see that you want to change. It sends a very powerful signal in a number of directions. Let me just conclude this segment of the webinar, which is the one on how you create this culture of feedback, by telling you a personal story. On the screen, you see a picture of my granddaughter holding a rather good-sized dog. It happens that she's decided in her career, both of her parents were medical doctors, and she decided she wanted to be a veterinarian. So she applied for a veterinarian school, which is about as hard to get into as I guess a traditional medical school. And she came to me one day and she said, "Grandpa," she said, "you've had a reasonable amount of success in your career. What one piece of advice would you give to me?" And, I'd been thinking about this a little bit, and I said, "Liza, ask the professors that you work with and the supervisors that you work for in clinics or wherever you're doing your work. Just ask them for their feedback to you about what you could have done to be an even more effective assistant or a more effective student." And she said, okay. She said, "I'll do that." About a year ago, she wrote me a letter, a long email, actually. She had received numerous offers for residencies and permanent employment positions in the future. She had no problem at all lining up a place where she could do her internship and where she could be accepted for getting a residency. And she said, "I attribute 100," she said, "that's unusual because normally students have to finish their 4 years of veterinarian school. Then they go on to do an internship. Then they go on and do a residency. And that often takes a long time and lots of applications and lots of complexity." And she said, "I attribute 100% of that outcome to the fact that I regularly asked my professors and my supervisors for their suggestions, their advice, their overall feedback." And she said, I'm 100% certain that I am where I am because I took your advice." So that's my story to conclude this part of the webinar. So Joe, let's go to part two.
Isn't that a great story? I love it. And we think that's a powerful skill. Well, now we're going to switch to the more common experience people have, and that's the giving and receiving and positive and negative feedback. And it's such a common thing, and most of us have some pretty good stories about that whole situation. Again, we're going to talk about positive reinforcement, the idea of identifying positive behaviors and the impact it had, and corrective feedback. So we're going to talk about the different processes. And in the self-assessment, you sort of talked or rated yourself on both of those two characteristics. So in our research, here's what we found that surprised us quite a bit. The first thing we found is that only 36% of leaders say they prefer to avoid giving positive feedback. Now, you have to I scratched my head. I said, why would people not want to give positive feedback? I mean, it's positive, for heaven's sakes. I mean, people want to hear it. It usually they smile. There's not that negative thing, but here's our data, and this is 14,000 people across the globe we're getting this data from. So 36% avoiding positive feedback. The interesting and more profound thing came from the negative feedback. And the preference, 62% of leaders have a strong preference for giving negative or corrective feedback. Okay? So a lot of supervisors, managers, and people, this sort of say, it's my job to tell people what's wrong, and I'm going to do that, and I need to do it. And so, again, we thought those are interesting facts. And as you think about that, does that surprise you? And so what might explain that data? Do you think managers think it's their duty to give corrective feedback? Are they mimicking a leadership behavior they've received? Is this the way they were treated? Do they believe that corrective feedback behavior is more beneficial to direct reports? Is it natural DNA playing out? Or do they believe that positive reinforcement is potentially dangerous, creating unreasonable expectations about salary and promotion? If you tell me something good, then, it's like, do you believe if I tell you something good that you're going to get promoted? What's my motive? So you can, we give you a choice of three. Choose three that you might think are, and this will be interesting. Jack, what do you think is going to lead the pack here in terms of?
I think it's my guess it will be a combination of that many managers think it's their duty. The first one, and although that this is what years ago they probably received from their bosses. I noticed that one of our participants in the chat room indicated that this was kind of disheartening kind of data. So be of good cheer, because we're going to tell you some things that are going to be reinforcing to what you're probably feeling. Anyway, that would be my guess. We'll see.
Yeah. Here's the results. Okay.
Yeah. First two were, yeah, okay.
And monkey see, monkey do, we're mimicking the leadership behavior we received. Very strong. And not very many people think it's DNA, so that's good.
Not a natural build quality. Okay, yeah.
Well, those are fun, and I think that's really interesting. Well, here's the interesting things. Tell us about some challenges here, Jack.
Well, I think there's most of us, if we were walking down the hall and our boss said to us, come into my office, I have some feedback for you. I suspect that for the great majority of people, there would be a good deal of stress. And that stress invokes some very strong kind of visceral emotional reactions. And indeed, there is this, the earlier research talked about how that we quoted from the NYU study, that, yeah, both giving and receiving feedback causes stress. A series of physiological things happen. The amygdala sends a distress signal to the rest of the brain. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system, and it sends out signals to the adrenal glands. Adrenaline is pumped into the bloodstream. The heart beats faster. Blood goes to the muscles. All these things are happening kind of not, by our choice. It's just the way we're wired. And so our pulse rate goes higher and our blood pressure goes up. And the point is that the word feedback has attached to it a good deal of kind of negative emotion and stress. And as we said earlier, so both the giver and the receiver are feeling a certain degree of stress. And the danger of giving this only corrective feedback is threefold. It damages relationships. It puts people in a negative mood, which often reduces their effort and also reduces their effectiveness in what they do. Corrective messages can trigger this real threat danger response in the brain, and it's instantaneous, and it's not always a logical kind of response. Indeed, there was a study done by some researchers a few years ago that found that about 38% of the time that rather than having a positive effect on people, it has a negative effect, and that corrective feedback, or negative feedback as we would describe it, does not benefit the individual all the time, like many managers think it does or believe it does.
All right. So if people are not confused yet, we're going to jump in, Jack, with both hands here.
Right.
And here's what we're going to show you. We're going to show you the data and the research that we've gathered. This is these are large studies, and on this one here, it looks at 9,763 people. Now, what we're looking at here is we're looking at these different preferences, giving and receiving, and giving positive and give negative, right? And so we ask people to rate themselves as and rate yourself on how effective you are at giving people honest, straightforward feedback. It was an agree, disagree scale. And so those who had the preference of avoiding giving positive feedback and avoids giving negative feedback, so they don't like to give either one, basically they rated themselves at about the 30th, or 30% agree with that. Now, if you look at those people that avoid giving positive but had a preference for giving negative feedback, how did they rate themselves at giving honest, straightforward feedback? 71% agree. They, on average, that was their average, that they agreed with that or strongly agreed with it. And those who give positive but avoid giving negative, so they tend to have a preference for positive, but they avoid giving negative, they rated themselves only 40% agree with that. So much lower. And those that give both positive and negative, that was the highest group. So
I think the real key here, Joe, is that these are your self ratings about how effective you are, not the
right,
rating of others,
yeah,
which we're going to talk about next. But
yeah,
I think that the participants on our webinar today need to see these were self ratings.
and what you see there is the people that rate themselves as being the best at giving feedback were those that had a preference for at least for giving negative feedback, right? That's the commonality here. Those that gave both positive and negative. So people think they're better at giving feedback if they give negative feedback. And so now we did a little trick, and what we did is we merged with the self-assessment with the feedback assessment, 360 feedback. So now we're looking at 1,500 people who get 360 feedback, and the question we're assessing here is gives honest feedback in a helpful way, but this is feedback from others, okay? So how do others rate people that avoid? They avoid giving positive and negative. So they rate that person at the 47th percentile on giving honest feedback. Those who avoid giving positive but give negative, okay, this will be drum roll here. Okay, actually, they're rated lower. They're rated only at the 41st percentile. Those who give positive but avoid giving negative were rated at the 54th percentile. So they were rated better at giving feedback by others, and those that give both positive and negative were even a point higher than that. The point here is that in the previous study, what we looked at was, well, people think who, for themselves, if you give negative feedback, they're more effective. But when we ask others, it sort of reverses itself. And then we looked at overall leadership effectiveness. And again, this is the overall rating of a leader. You can see those that avoid giving positive feedback and give negative feedback were rated lower than those that avoided. And those that got the highest scores here were those that gave only positive or those that both give positive and negative. The last one we want to look at here is your effectiveness at asking for feedback. And so we first started this around this whole habit of asking for feedback. And we found those who avoid were at the 53rd percentile. Those that give negative and avoids giving positive and give negative were significantly lower at the 41st percentile. And you can see those that give positive and avoid negative, 63rd percentile, both what people, and this is asking for feedback. So it's interesting that those who avoid and give negative feedback were less effective, and they were even less effective at asking for feedback. Now, we gave you a self-assessment, and the self-assessment was only, we had just 5 items in the self-assessment, but you were rated on 2 scales, giving negative corrective feedback and giving positive reinforcing feedback. And you got a positive or negative score, right? And the positive score indicates a preference, right? Or, you know, you in this case, a person gets a 3, so their preference is higher for giving negative feedback, and it was a negative number on giving positive feedback. So you can kind of see if your preference is positive towards it or negative to avoid it. And so we want to kind of show you the global data here and how to sort of think about yourself. And if your score was a -5 to a -1, that's the avoid column. And if it was positive, 1 to 5, that's the prefer column. And so if you look at the giving negative, average score on this assessment, 39% avoid giving negative, 61 prefer. And this is 5 item self-assessment. And if you look at the gives, 31% avoid and gives positive, and 69% prefer. So that's our normative data on that. And, you know, the interesting thing is this quote here. Jack, why don't you tell them about that?
Abraham Maslow, this famed psychologist who talked a lot about people being self-actualized, made this comment that if all you have in your toolbox is a hammer, everything you see looks like a nail. And so if you only are looking for people's mistakes and things that they don't do right or don't do well, then you give negative feedback. But if you can broaden your perspective, and if you're looking for the things that people are doing right, doing well, doing effectively, doing more creatively, then you're much more inclined to kind of give them a positive or reinforcing feedback rather than corrective feedback.
Jack, you have met Abraham Maslow, didn't you?
No, I did never meet him in person. No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Well, I hadn't either.
Yeah.
Well, here's the impact that I think I want to show you here. And it's about the danger of having this preference around avoiding positive and preferring negative. What we're looking at here is our 360 assessment, the 19 competencies. And what you see there is having a preference for avoiding giving positive and preferring to give negative feedback. You can look at our data here and you can see that those people scored significantly lower on every leadership competency. And those that preferred to give positive and avoid to give negative.
Green column.
Yeah, green column. Thanks, Jack. Yeah, that's higher. The gives both positive and negative was not as high, but is higher. And so this, you know, if you think about, I mean, you're better off avoiding giving feedback than having this negative preference for feedback. To me, that is a stunning, stunning slide. Now, I do have some good news. We looked at people pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And what we found is that on the item actively looks for opportunities to get feedback to improve myself, we found a significant increase And on giving honest feedback in a helpful way, we found another significant increase. So it looks like we're getting better at giving feedback, and the pandemic sort of maybe stimulated that a little bit. I'm not sure how to explain that, but I think that's part of it. And then the other thing is on the self-assessment, we found a change, an increase in giving positive feedback and a slight decrease in giving negative feedback. So I think things are changing, and things are going to be better.
Okay, we want to conclude our comments here today just by saying we've talked about two broad issues. One is, how do you create a culture where people have a practice of asking for feedback rather than expecting their manager to give them feedback gratuitously, and the benefits that brings. And secondly, we've talked about this balance of negative feedback versus praise, reinforcement, kudos, and how valuable that is. But this applies not only to our relationships in business, but it applies to our personal relationships. So many of you have probably heard of a man named John Gottman, who he and his wife have done some amazing research in the world of marriage and marriage relationships. And he observed many married couples, counted the number of positive and negative interactions they had with each other. What he discovered was that if a married couple had a relationship of 5 positive interactions to every 1 negative interaction, the probability that they would stay together was significantly higher. Whereas if that was reversed and they had a preponderance of negative interactions in comparison to their positive one, he could predict with a fairly high degree of accuracy who would end up in divorce. So I think not only does this apply to our work and our relationships with our colleagues, but it applies to our relationships with our neighbors and our friends and our fellow parishioners in our religious community. That this idea of focusing on the positive and telling people about the things that they do well. I saw one of the comments was, how do you give positive reinforcement if a person isn't doing a brilliant job of accomplishment and right now? And I think the answer is, you do what Carol Dweck and her research on a growth mindset would say: focus on their effort, focus on their energy and tenacity, and not always on the end accomplishment. And so that you can find things to praise, and that will gain you greater support and greater performance than simply focusing on what's not done well. So the preference for giving positive feedback leads team members to feel valued and appreciated. Corrective and negative feedback can also be given very judiciously, but the higher ratings on feedback and development and overall leadership come when there's a very delicate balance between the positive and the negative, with a strong preference for the positive.
I think it's important, Jack, to know here, we're not saying never give corrective feedback.
No.
But we are saying, let's balance that. And it's the people that gave both positive and negative, they did fine. And it's this preference for negative and having that. The last quote here, just the key to learning is feedback is merely impossible to. The key to learning is feedback is nearly impossible to learn anything without it. This is from Steve Levitt. Steve Levitt is an economist at the University of Chicago, also the co-author of Freakonomics, and he's also has a podcast called People I Mostly Admire, which is strongly recommended. So feedback is a gift, and we think positive is a bigger gift. So keep giving it.
Thank you, Jack and Joe. So I loved all of that valuable research on feedback, and something we all need to hear for every aspect of your life. So now that you know more about feedback, what should you do about it? Well, we want to invite you to attend our Extraordinary Leader Development Experience, which is coming up in April. I think that'd be really valuable for your development and growth. If you want to learn more about it, you can visit our website for more information on upcoming events. And you can also find more research from Zinger Folkman there, and some articles and podcasts that we've done on feedback specifically. We have a drawing for you guys because the best thing that we can get from you is your feedback on how we did on this webinar. So you can enter to win a $25 Amazon gift card if you take our exit survey. You can find the link in the chat or right there on the page, that bit.ly ZF feedback exit. And please give us all the good, the positive feedback, the corrective feedback. And let us know if you're interested in learning more about Zinger Folkman's offerings, our coaching. I know we talked a little bit about coachability today. So you can raise your hand and we'll have some of our associates follow up with you. So thank you for coming today, and enter to win that drawing, and we'll see you next month.